and PhD student at the Faculty of Architecture in KU Leuven. His research and talk tonight examines the impact of 20th century Belgian education on interior design on the identity and formation of the discipline of interior design. So over to you, Benoît.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexandra. Yeah, so as you have said, I'm looking into the history of educational programs in interior designs to see how schools in the past have dealt with the disciplinary identity of this designer profile, which as a more recently emerged profession is often described as being supplemental to other disciplines. So tonight I'll be addressing a specific episode in the educational history of interior design in Belgium, which is, as a previous speaker, the process towards mixed gender education, this time in a Catholic school network in the 1960s. This development coincided with major reforms of the interior design program, making it a useful case to identify the gendering of a discipline within scholarly institutions. Tonight, I'm looking particularly at official school documents that are drafted by an all-male teaching staff. So I'm starting with a letter on September 11th, 1960, sent between two Catholic congregations, both engaged in education in the Belgian city of Ghent. The sender was a member of the Brothers of Christian Schools and a principal of the St. Luke's School for Architecture and the Decorative Arts that taught a program in interior design. The recipient was the Reverend Mother of the convent in charge of Nieuwenbos, which was a secondary school just a stone's throw away from St. Luke. The subject of the letter was the need for co-education. Both schools offered training only to either male or female students, and the all-girls school did not offer any degrees in higher education, let alone degrees in artistic or design disciplines. According to the letter, the Catholic education system was failing female students. After all, religious women could excel at the design of liturgic clothing, religious imagery, or silversmithing. Interior design was also found suitable for women pursuing careers in teaching, as well as for future housewives. Architecture in the letter gets no mention whatsoever. Can I get the first slide, please? So before going into this designation of gender to certain design disciplines, the context of Catholic education in 1960s Belgium needs some clarification. The boys' school was part of the larger St. Luke's School network that constituted the main Catholic programs in architecture and applied arts. In post-war Belgium, education was still heavily pillarized, meaning that the ideological bedrock of scholarly institutions largely dictated the curriculum. For the St. Luke schools, this entailed that aesthetic principles were bearers of moral and religious underpinnings, and that design choices pertained to liturgic practices, personal development, and family values. The interior design program was rooted in that same conviction. It was founded at St. Luke in 1951, 9 years prior to the letter on co-education, and thus accessible only to men. By both designing and publishing interiors as representations of school-specific values, like the both images you can see on the slide here, St. Luke expected their graduates to take on an educational role toward the users of their designs. For interior design especially, constituting the most direct interaction with the user, students were supposed to morally inform and enlighten by adopting a morphological language that was largely historically informed and rejected trends or novelties in terms of material use and aesthetics. Can I get the next slide, please? So this specific political climate categorically prohibited co-education. The brothers historically only targeted men, and the decision to allow women belonged to the diocese, deeming their presence at the schools unacceptable, presumably disturbing both the concentration of students and the vocation of brothers. However, the gradual change in attitude by the 1960s was largely strategic. As the schools remarked some years before, young women who had an aptitude for the creative industry were compelled to attend state-funded academies, which were liberal institutes that lacked a moral foundation upon which the St. Luke schools were founded. The Nieuwenbos classrooms, which are located on the right side of this slide, this presented a solution that technically didn't break any of the rules. The brothers, based on the left, would simply replicate some programs for a female audience. Starting from 1961, 3 programs were installed this way: a teacher training, a decorative arts degree, and of course, interior design. So while officially studying at the St. Luke School and getting courses by male teachers, the female students never left the premises of the Girls' Institutes. However, this cooperation soon turned sour. The brothers clearly considered the situation a temporary one and had requested permission for co-education from the Vatican, bypassing the local authority of the Bishop of Ghent. Not surprisingly, Nieuwenbos in turn approached the diocese to ensure the classes remained at their own institution, unsuccessfully. In 1966, parents were informed that their daughters were henceforth expected to attend classes at St. Luke, together with the male students. The interior design program, the last apple of this court, is belatedly transferred in 1967, though it's not very clear why. Some documents mention practical reasons, like the availability of infrastructure, but others suggest that the female congregation took pride in their involvement in artistic education, even though they weren't involved with the content of the classes. When one of the sisters applied for the position of assistant principal at St. Luke in an attempt to reconcile both institutions, she was met with ridicule and found incompetent. Still, Nieuwenbos's claim to the program of interior design was legitimate. Other all-female congregation schools in Belgium had effectively installed and maintained programs in interior design throughout the 1960s. These were mainly rooted in classes on homemaking and targeted a public of well-to-do young Catholic women. The little archival material kept at these kinds of institutions makes it hard to reconstruct how the profession of interior design was being perceived and conceptualized. But as opposed to architecture, the discipline had a history of being educated in girls' schools. And Belgium certainly doesn't evade the historic assignation of interior to the female and the domestic sphere. More recently, design historians like Penny Spark and Lucinda Caucus-Haverhand have argued that this attribution of gender also contributed to the marginalization of the discipline, especially in an architectural context. In Belgium too, the discipline was systematically labeled secondary to the architecture programs upon educational reforms. While the St. Luke schools and others lobbied for recognition of the degree, the study period was shortened and it was never equated to a university degree like the architecture program was. Can I get the next slide, please? Whether this classification can be ascribed to gender is speculative at best. But interestingly, St. Luke was reconsidering its program at the same time of establishing co-education. Interior design's supposed inferiority instigated a search for a specific non-supplemental identity to legitimize the educational program. In 1966, the schools argued that an autonomous status cannot be attained as long as the programs remain similar to other comparable programs like industrial design, architectural drawing, or upholstery. To emancipate from this position, the schools consider interior design as a spatial architectural discipline, though epistemologically differing from architecture. To illustrate this, they differentiate 2 architectural approaches, one coming from the outside, analytical and social, the other coming from the inside, concerned with interior space and individual interiority. Remarkably, and as is stated in this quote, they ascribe the emergence of interior design as a discipline to the predominant focus on the first conception, and see great capacity in this new profile that would also be defined by its closer collaboration with other actors like architects and inhabitants. The contemporary implementation of co-education brought about epistemological claims of its own, this time between women and men. By addressing the social and pedagogical impact of co-education, gender inevitably became an explicit topic at St. Luke. The process of self-realization, which was considered to be the basic principle of education, is not a gender-neutral one. In official documents, the brothers recognized a difference between men and women in the way they are socialized, and they describe and emphasize the female life world in order for the all-male teaching staff to acquire the necessary awareness to educate and evaluate female students. And you can take that quite literally, as this information was composed in a single document to be distributed to the entire staff. They argue, and I quote, that girls ending up in a male environment should be allowed to mature according to their own disposition. This assumption also generated the acknowledgement of gender-specific differences in designing, male students being more creative and level-headed, female students being more sensitive, intuitive, and adaptable. They should each be targeting specific design disciplines accordingly. What's more interesting than this largely gender-normative discussion is the potential being ascribed to the female standpoint. According to the brothers, the experience of men had previously determined the way architectural and artistic projects were being valued, which had resulted in a limited appreciation of this so-called female disposition. So as such, they basically identified two distinct ways of knowing that could both complicate and diversify the architectural discipline. On the one hand, an essentialist female standpoint in the context of co-education, and on the other, a spatially divergent approach for interior design. Thereby, the schools unknowingly play into the debate developed by scholars like Havehand, who plead not only for the recognition of attributes considered feminine or effeminate in interior design, but for their revalorization, ascribing specific potential to the viewpoint of the marginalized interior designer. To what extent that these official school documents also had repercussions in the classrooms remains to be determined. But the undeniable majority of 90% female students in the interior architecture classes today suggests the female gendering of the discipline persists, both in the way it is perceived by prospective students and how it is taught in schools and universities. I believe the session after the break will go further into that. But if this assignation informs a value system that systematically negates graduated designers in local or national architectural histories of its education can be a fruitful starting point to deconstruct gendered perceptions as they constitute the place where disciplinary identities are most strongly being negotiated. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Benoît, for sharing your research with us this evening. Our next speaker is Barbara Jaffee, Associate Professor of Modern Art and Design History at Northern Illinois University. Barbara's work looks at the relationship between fine and applied arts in the first half of the 20th century, and tonight she will be sharing with us the work of the art historian Helen Gardner in her art history textbook, Art Through the Ages. So I will hand over to you, Barbara.
Great, thank you, Alex. And thank you, Claire. If I could have my first slide, please. The art historian Helen Gardner earned her master's in art history at the University of Chicago in 1915 and taught a survey of world art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago from 1920 until her death in 1946. I myself earned 2 arts degrees at SAIC and a PhD at the University of Chicago, and have lived all my life in the city where Helen Gardner lived her whole life. And yet I had no idea who she was until pretty recently. This is despite the fact that Gardner's major accomplishment, the single volume survey Art Through the Ages shown here, is a staple of the American college market and is known throughout the world. The popular textbook was first published in 1926 and has gone through numerous printings and multiple editions, the 16th of which is due out this August, while Gardner remains a vestigial presence at best, acknowledged only by the proprietary retitling of the book as Gardner's Art Through the Ages, beginning with the first posthumous edition in 1959. I think it's fair to say of Helen Gardner in the context of this series that she's been hiding in plain sight. Next slide, please. Among the many truly surprising and remarkable aspects of the original 3 editions of Art Through the Ages, as authored by Gardner, is how inclusive the books were. In its first edition, Art Through the Ages covered both the usual array of ancient civilizations, understood at the time as formative of the contemporary West, i.e. Egypt, Greece, and Rome, but also more unusually what the author described as the independent traditions of the ancient Americas and of Asia. For her 1936 revision, Gardner expanded the reach of her survey to include Africa, Oceania, and as we see here on the upper right, the manufactured products of modernized mass culture, what Gardner delightedly called, quote, the simple, gaily colored gadget from the 5 and 10, close quote. Gardner did not show much interest in the art of her own transitional age, as she described it in 1926, lamenting the absence of social utility in contemporary art practices. As she said, quote, art has become segregated from the affairs of life as something to be treated with indifference or disregarded, or as a luxury, something to be indulged in upon occasions, or as a means of ostentation. It is the age of the museum and the exhibition, both unnatural, close quote. But in 1936, Gardner discovered the true modernity of American art in such unabashedly anonymous industrial forms as grain elevators. She praised the public face of painting, including the decorative mural commissions that graced the entertainment palaces and commercial skyscrapers of the 1920s and early 1930s, and those, in her words, designing machine-made articles as well as ballet settings and reaching out into the fields of weaving, ceramics, and glass, as shown in the examples here of glassware by the Dutch designer A.D. Copier and a textile by the American painter Ruth Reeves. Gardner's interest in the integration of modernism across media may have been piqued by her training as a medievalist in the Germanic tradition of psychological aesthetics and formalism, particularly the tradition of research into the art of all cultures without comparative evaluation. The final image on this slide shows how Gardner encouraged her students to create diagrams of canonical artworks, in this case, the Wedding Dance of 1566 by Peter Bruegel the Elder, and the schematic rendering of its composition, or psychedelic hedgerow, as I like to call it, to its lower right, as a means of demonstrating their understanding of what Gardner believed were universal principles of design. I have the last slide, please. But there's almost nothing to prepare the reader for what Gardner has in mind in 1945, as she works on the third edition of Art Through the Ages, that is a wide-ranging, virtually horizontal view of the world's diverse cultures. This vast panoply, or panorama, as Gardner calls it, in which medieval Chinese artifacts commingle with the Renaissance art of the Indians of the American Northwest coast, is pressed into urgent service as a demonstration of the inevitable progress of world art toward a unified visual culture based in science and technology, the arts of the machine, as Gardner titled her culminating chapter. Her futuristic gambit included a rhetorical flourish associated with the then burgeoning movement for a world constitution, a movement based in Chicago, whose rallying cry, "One world or none," was made in direct response to the very recent nuclear devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. Gardner's visionary approach, clearly visible in her 1948 table of contents, was to take the four great chronological periods that have dominated the writing of Western history, ancient, medieval, Renaissance, and modern, and use them against their narrative grain, presenting hefty cross-sections of the simultaneous rather than the relentless forward march of the sequential. As outlined in her brief preface, the book begins with the rise of great cultures and isolation, continues through an age of early contact between Asia, North Africa, and Europe, and colonization, in which conflict or assimilation accelerates the shrinking of the globe. And in the last part of the book, quote, "Through unbelievable advances in transportation and communication is revealed one world in which the nations are becoming acquainted with each other, are learning from each other, and are to a considerable extent producing works of art which, despite national divergences, come within an international framework," close quote. It probably won't surprise you to learn that little of Gardner's utopian scheme survives the 1959 revision of her text by the Yale University Art History Department under the direction of Sumner McKnight Crosby. Some 13 years after Gardner's death, the Yale edition knowingly recapitulates the partitions of the new Cold War world order, including a major division of the material into European and non-European parts. By contrast, Gardner had stated explicitly that her intention with the fourth edition was to break down what she called, quote, our Europocentric attitude toward art, close quote. According to the new editors in 1959, their reorganization represented a return to normalcy in its rejection of globalism, reinstatement of traditional hierarchies, and reinforcement of temporal and spatial boundaries. In this way, the editors argued, the presumably distinctive stylistic coherence of European art was preserved, but at considerable expense. Not only would the anonymously produced objects so important to Gardner's discussion no longer appear side by side with works bespeaking individual genius, as traditional canonical works were reinscribed into the realm of pure art, but the modern industrial design that had been the goal of Gardner's insistent teleology simply disappears. It would take the end of the Cold War to produce a canon anywhere near as inclusive as Helen Gardner's again. But the radically futurist Helen Gardner herself has been much more difficult to recover. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Our final paper for the first half of this evening will be given by a trio of researchers. Dina Benbrahim, who you may know from one of our earlier Hidden History seminars, is Assistant Professor of Graphic Design at the University of Arkansas, and together with Lisa Maione, who is Assistant Professor of the Graphic Design Program at Kansas City Art University and co-chair of the Diversity Working Group at the college, and Bree McMahon, who is Assistant Professor of Graphic Design and Director of Graduate Studies at the Master's Design Program at the University of Arkansas, will be discussing resistance against colonial discourses. And a reminder that after this paper, we will have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions for any of our speakers, please put them in the chat. And after the Q&A, we'll take a short break before the second half of the evening. So over to you, Dina, Lisa, and Bree.
Thank you, Alexandra and Claire, for having us. Hello, my name is Lisa Maione.
Hi, my name is Bree McMahon.
And I'm Dina Benbrahim. Thank you for having us today and also for attending our session. It's called Contested Classrooms, a Pedagogy of Resistance Against Colonial Discourses. And I think we would like to start by simply defining what we mean by contested classrooms. This term was coined by Jeannie Ludlow, who thought that it was a more pertinent space for learning and collaboration, since safe spaces actually imply power and privilege, which means it encompasses the understanding that the intersections of our identities might not make us safe in a classroom setting. And so as educators who are also teaching design history or histories, we asked ourselves multiple questions while making our curriculum. And part of these were, how do we co-create a curriculum that invites young design students to investigate narratives outside the white heteronormative, male-dominated and capitalist dominant narrative? Where do we research when an online search leads nowhere? How do we look for information when we don't even know it exists? And what tools, entry points, and precedents do we use to teach design histories when actually traditional textbooks and most resources perpetuate erasure?
Could we advance to our first slide now, please? Thank you. So we'll start with shared authority. Like Dina said, in this context, we really encourage collaborative assignments to build inspiration and incite curiosity within our students. And along with our students, we use digital tools to visualize history collaboratively and also connect networks of overlooked stories that are curated by students. So for example, we facilitate collaborative chronological mapping exercises and creative workshops within digital spaces like Miro. We also facilitate the construction of nodes representing historical relationships in collective Google Slides. We use public platforms to disseminate and archive research, things like Instagram posts and accounts We do group podcasting, conferences, and facilitate public events with local organizations.
We also use print as a way to make research accessible to the design community. For example, Dina and myself collaborated within the context of her advanced typography studio course, and for myself, a graphic design histories course. Students co-created a book called Seeking Plural Narratives, compiling their research for the semester. Through this project, we have the opportunity to discuss strategies to learn from design histories and the idea of multiple perspectives using decolonial and feminist methodologies. And moreover, to look at any and all published material out there with a newly critical eye. Through this project, we hold ourselves accountable to expand the narratives we tell, and also acknowledge that compiling any publication means we are editing, perhaps overlooking something. The pursuit of histories is always the project. This book was printed through Lulu and made available for a reasonable price and is activated as a reading for subsequent cohorts. Next slide, please.
So as we work collaboratively to connect stories in plural contexts, nourish respectful curiosity, expand our understanding of design, we really encourage dialogue and reflection in multiple flexible ways. We design prompts with varied steps and outputs such as zines, sketch notes, videos, group discussions, and workshops that you see here collaged. Students also have the agency to choose the outcome they want to pursue at every stage and are led by their research process primarily.
So in a lot of ways, this approach is oppositional to traditional art history courses at our institutions. We really value applied components in this course, which is valuable for every young designer's practice. By modeling this course after a more familiar studio environment, it discourages this sage on the stage classroom structure that we might be all familiar with, and also this trope of a genius instructor. So we encourage students to become more collaborative, engaged, and just become more reflective practitioners.
And as well, instead of considering students, learners as passive actors, maybe to reference Paulo Freire as piggy banks by serving them neat little portions of knowledge, these kinds of projects and teaching methods invite students to reflect on their positionality, to determine their biases as student researchers, to think with and beyond their positionality by actively listening for multiple voices, and to be active actors in this course, and to construct that space together, and hence enable their agency and hopes to create a community of radical thinkers together. Next slide, please.
So seen here are quotes from some of our student evaluations and reflections where they were at odds with this approach to our pedagogy.
So if you are doing similar work, think of a time when feedback from students were at odds with your contested classroom. While plurality is really necessary to pursue in all design courses because the alternative is simply complacent and embarrassing and quite honestly complicit to the erasure of identities, this work really does not happen without pain. And this pain also needs to be made visible in multiple ways, including this one where we are here to talk about it. Prompting students to reimagine their design practice through the lens of missing or underwritten histories is really uncomfortable and even frustrating at times. It invites resistance, but it goes beyond this. Incompleteness is often perceived as a lack of structure and even incompetence because students expect this finished history with bullet points rather than unfinished history with an expansive web of stories to discover. And so some students feel that this is not design history, but thankfully others feel that we are planting plural seeds.
Yeah, and adding to that, the experience of displacement from one's position can feel destabilizing, and it is destabilizing. To decenter one's gravity is a practice, and overcoming the doubt of others and of ourselves in that instability, it's part of the subject matter that we're studying together when we're looking at design histories. And it certainly doesn't happen all in one and resolve all in one course's time. The contested space versus a completed, resolved space in a classroom in particular. Some learners may come in more ready to understand how to be challenged by this kind of space more than others. And it's part of the experience of the course and part of our work as facilitators of a course like this to practice with these tools to pursue that contested space with our students. Factors such as the size of the class, say as it manifests in the intimacy and the trust between students in the group, the context within the university or institution, the positionality of the educators and students, and really the cohort of learners, all of us together combined. The intellectual and emotional labor on such a course can be intense and at times can feel disheartening. And in that spirit, now thinking of a time when feedback from a student or students was in alignment with your contested classroom as you've been doing this work.
I hope that made everyone think of maybe a time that your work felt aligned with a contested classroom. One quote that is not seen here that was brought up is from a student was, "I think that it would have been beneficial to have this course split up into two sections, History of Graphic Design 1 and History of Graphic Design 2. There were many moments where I wish we had gone more in depth into certain movements or time periods." We agree with the student. Design Histories deserves a series of courses rather than just having one, or in some cases none. Or perhaps even relabeling the courses in the curriculum, designating it as a graphic design course rather than an art history course. An alternative, especially for programs that cannot logistically implement a design history course, these programs might better integrate historical discussions in the courses they already have. So in these ways, we could capture students' curiosity at different levels and continue to reinforce some of the concepts that we're trying to teach.
So thank you everyone for your time and attention today, and we'd love to open it up for a rich conversation between all of these papers that we've been hearing about this morning. So all questions welcome. Thank you.